Bibliophiles of the internet, my name's Adriana, and today I'm here to bring you my Queer Lit Read-a-thon wrap-up. That's right, the Queer Lit Read-a-thon has come and gone, and I'd say it was a really successful week. And before I forget, I really want to shout out my lovely friends Kathy and Rogan for allowing me to help co-host this event because it was a really great experience. If you saw my TBR video, you know I initially planned on reading 4 books. That quickly got extended to 6 books, and I actually completed all 6 of those books. First up, I read Fire Song by Adam Garnett Jones. This is Own Voice's native queer lit about a main character who is queer and two-spirit. It's about Shane, whose younger sister Destiny has recently committed suicide, and since then his mom has shut everything and everyone out because she is not in a good place. That means she's not going to work, there's no money coming in, and Shane is left to deal with the emotional and financial turmoil by himself. Before this, he had plans to get off the reservation by going to college in Toronto, but now because he has no way to pay for it, those plans are indefinitely put on hold until he can figure out something else. He is also very much in love with his friend David, who is the only person he can trust, but his community is not ready for them to be out. This book does contain triggers for peripheral mentions of suicide, suicide ideation, drug and alcohol addiction, sexual assault, and abuse. I was really surprised by this because the story was actually created and produced as a film first and only later adapted into a book. And I think reading this you would never know because it's such a deeply emotional narrative, which you would not expect coming from a script, especially because scripts are usually very sparse and to the point. But this is very well rounded out, and I truly felt so much for each of these characters. Shane is really interesting to read about because he's very emotionally reserved and repressed. He and his mom are going through something extremely difficult and stressful, but neither of them are willing to face it or even bring it up. And that spills over into every area of Shane's life. He transfers his grief into shame about his relationship with David, and that makes him deny his own feelings, which in turn makes him subscribe to toxic behaviors. Shane has not given himself permission to just breathe and be himself, and his grief over Destiny really aggravates that reflex. I also appreciate how the story comments on how Native nations are heavily regulated by the government, probably more than any other group. The very outline of their lives is built into legislation and the system itself, where they can and cannot go, where they can and cannot build, how they can and cannot develop their lands, the funds they can and cannot receive. But there are technicalities built into the fine print, and when they don't receive those funds or those permissions, their options become very limited very fast. And that often makes people in these groups turn to cyclical behavior like self-harm, violence, drug abuse, illegal activities, not because they're inherently bad people, but because they do not have the privilege of trusting that things will change. So you definitely see that coming into play, and you see Shane struggling with his fear that he will become a bad stereotype no matter what choice he makes. Either he becomes a bum Indian for staying on the reservation forever, or he becomes a noble Indian for pursuing his education in college and quote-unquote rising above. And I think eventually he realizes that he has the capacity to make good choices and bad choices, but the only one he cannot live with is the choice to not make a choice. And if he gives up, he forfeits that privilege of what it means to exist. The only thing I question about this story is Shane's connection with David, because we don't really know the basis for their relationship. It's established before the book even starts. And the two of them do take part in some infidelity since Shane already has a girlfriend and he's not ready to be out. And cheating on people is obviously not my favorite. I didn't feel like that was a necessary part of the story because Shane could have just not had a girlfriend and literally nothing would have changed about the book. So even though this wasn't perfect, it was a really honest and powerful reading experience. I gave it 4 stars. After that, I listened to This Is Kind of an Epic Love Story by Kieran Callender, read by Ron Butler, which I'll admit upfront was my least favorite book of the week. It's about Nathan, who is a chronic pessimist and who does not believe in the lasting power of love or romance. He's an aspiring filmmaker, but he's seen too many relationships fall apart to believe that they really work, either on screen or in real life. That is, until his old childhood friend and crush, Oliver James Hernandez, comes back to town and makes his way back into Nathan's life. It's worth noting that both main characters are people of color, and Oliver is hard of hearing and does occasionally prefer to use ASL to communicate, which is represented on the page. Besides the representation and the way Nathan is presented as a very self-aware protagonist, I had a very hard time with this. I think my main problem is that in all of the promotional information, this story is billed as a fluffy rom-com where the love interest reignites something in the protagonist and through a series of uncanny events makes them rethink their stance on love. And this story did not actually do that. The book is so oversaturated with drama, and I won't even trivialize it by calling it teen drama because it's not that the characters are teenagers, it's just that it's endless and there's nothing else to balance it out. Of course, in any good book you need sources of tension and unrest and conflict. But in stories primarily focused on romance, like this one, that's usually balanced out with a solid friend group or a great love interest or some other anchoring element. But here we don't get that. The main character's friends are kind of trash, and they're actually a huge source of drama and anxiety in his life. There's tension, but there's little to no joy. There's no sense of relief. Stories with any kind of romance have to have an element of discovery and excitement. You have to have those scenes where you need these characters to be together and finally bridge that gap because the pairing is just so undeniably right. And that doesn't have to look the same across the board for every relationship. Some relationships hinge on sexual desire or tension. Some relationships are fluffy and sweet. Some are both. Others are more platonic. But this story presents none of the above. This pairing didn't make me feel giddy. They didn't give me a reason to hope. In fact, I can't think of a single moment that wasn't a makeout scene where Nathan was just full of the pure excitement that romantic possibility brings. I also felt like there was a slight conflation between wanting to be in a romantic relationship and wanting to have sex. Obviously, there can be overlap between the two ideas, and if that's what both of the characters want, then it should be explored on the page, but I didn't feel like there was the proper distinction between those developments. I know it seems like I'm going hard on this book, but for me, it did not deliver on the rom and it did not deliver on the com, so what am I supposed to do with that? If you saw my TBR video, you know I was so excited for this and so ready to love it, so believe me when I say that the person most disappointed with everything I just said is myself. I gave this one 2 stars. Then from my library, I read/listened to Ivy Aberdeen's Letter to the World by Ashley Herring Blake, read by Chloe Cannon. This is a middle grade story about Ivy, whose home is destroyed in a tornado, leaving her family of newly 6 displaced. To make things worse, in the process of moving from the remains of her house to a storm shelter to a hotel, she loses her secret notebook full of drawings of girls holding hands. Back at school, Ivy starts finding her drawings dropped into her locker along with notes encouraging her to express her truth. And Ivy hopes that these notes are from a classmate named June who just happens to be her first crush. I was not ready for how perfect and beautiful and soft this book was. It strikes that perfect balance between growing pains and the journey to self-acceptance. There's a lot of parallels of placelessness in Ivy's life. She has no home to go back to, no concrete place in a family that makes her always feel like she's in the way, no clear-cut identity to claim for herself. She doesn't know where she's gonna land on any of these issues, and that makes her feel a bit lost, especially because she doesn't have the vocabulary or experience to navigate these questions yet. And the story touches on how this whole process is even more confusing than it has to be because the society we live in still reflects back largely heteronormative ideals. Luckily, Ivy is not the only queer character in this book. She has other resources, other examples, other beacons of light. She has June, who is the first person who sees Ivy for exactly who she is, the person Ivy trusts the most. I also love that what Ivy and June share the most is their passion for art. Especially during times of disaster, art is one of the first things that falls to the wayside. But for these two characters, there is freedom and truth in creating art. It's an exploratory space where they can envision whatever they want for themselves and project themselves into that art. One of the most beautiful things this story has to offer is the idea that it's okay to be curious and to not have all the answers. We all have pieces of ourselves we don't want people to see, things that we try to handle by ourselves because we assume we know what people will think. But we can ease our burdens when we're honest with others and with ourselves. Because when we hide from other people, more often than not, we're really trying to hide from ourselves. For me, this was a triumphant love letter to self-exploration and self-acceptance. There was nothing about this I did not love. I gave it 5 stars. Around the same time, I was reading Coffee Boy by Austin Chant. This is an Own Voices story about a trans character named Kieran who has just landed himself an internship in a political campaign office. He enjoys the work, but he also has to deal with casual transphobia in the workplace, and there's also an obnoxious campaign strategist named Seth who is always on his case. Turns out Seth has an incredibly obvious crush on their incredibly straight boss, and as Kieran gives him hell about it from the sidelines, he might just be developing an irrational crush of his own on Seth. First of all, can I just say, Austin Chant is really out here writing trans characters getting the love and respect they deserve, and because of that, I have gained like 20 years of life. I really love the contrast between these two characters. Kieran is a straight shooter, he's a realist, he says what he thinks even if he doesn't consider the consequences. Seth has a very strict, icy, detached disposition, but he's actually super soft and sensitive, and I just love the dynamics of that match. They both have really surprising layers to their lives, and it's really wonderful to witness them discovering that bit by bit. This novella is also incredibly vocal on issues trans employees face in the workplace. Whether it's being called by the wrong pronouns, not being invited to be part of the office culture, or being unsure of whether you're singled out for your talents or because you're someone's diversity pick, there's a lot to unpack. And I love that even before anything remotely romantic happens, Seth is a very vocal advocate for Kieran receiving the respect he deserves. His tactics are not always perfect and he doesn't have all the answers, but he tries. At one point he tells Kieran, "You can expect this place to be better and to be safe," which is a truly beautiful thing to say, especially when most trans folks take on the extra labor of correcting people themselves. Here is someone with privilege and power saying they are willing to be the bad guy and do that work themselves. At the same time, Seth has plenty to learn, and Kieran helps him realize that while being proactive is good, any behavior that actively singles out marginalized people does not create a safe workspace. They have to work on shifting the office culture and norms without positioning Kieran as the cause, because this is work they should have been doing from the start in the first place. My only note is that because the story is really short, the romance does develop pretty fast, going from 0 to 60 in a very short space. One moment we're in the office, and then a few pages later the characters are having sex. And I'm not complaining about the sex, I am here for the sex. And in fact, I love Austin Chant showing a trans character who knows their body, who loves their body, who knows how to enact their own pleasure without missing a beat. I actually think those are some of the most impactful scenes. As I said, the relationship did develop faster than I expected, but besides that, I have absolutely no complaints. I gave this gem 4.5 stars. Then, because I was feeling good and confident, I added on Check Please by Ngozi Okazu to fulfill the challenge of reading a queer comic. This is a queer sports comic about a former ice skating champion, current vlogger and baker in residence, Biddy, who has just joined the hockey team as a freshman in college. He is the smallest player on the team and deathly afraid of being checked, but with some help from the super hot, super broody team captain Jack, Biddy might just find his footing on the ice. And in love. Now, I was familiar with this story as a webcomic before it was traditionally published, but honestly, nothing can prepare you for the extreme levels of cute this comic achieves. I love that Biddy is the literal softest boy in existence who cares about his team so much. He brings them sweaters and bakes them pies and puts together goodie bags. He is just too precious for this universe. And to have this character who is openly queer and who finds strength and purpose in that softness be such a centerpiece for this team is really important, especially considering how sports typically creates spaces where toxic masculinity and aggression and homophobia are celebrated and even encouraged. That sends a powerful message about how any space can be a safe space. Biddy's teammates love him and respect him because of who he is and how he is, not in spite of it. Their adoration of him is genuine and unironic. And the slow, simmering romance between Biddy and Jack is all kinds of cute. Give me an entire comic of a small boy falling for a tall boy while they practice physical contact on the ice and bake pies together in close quarters, and I can just die of happiness on the spot. Obviously, I love this so much, and I gave it 4.5 stars. And finally, to my own surprise, from my library, I read/listened to Girls of Paper and Fire by Natasha Nayan, read by Alison Hiroto, which miraculously I finished in about a day and a half. This is an Own Voices Asian-inspired fantasy about Lei, whose family is part of the lowest class known as the paper caste, meaning they lack demon features and abilities, which are seen as desirable magical traits. However, she does have these mysterious golden eyes, and it's the color of her eyes that catches the Demon King's interest, which is why she's stolen away from her family and forced to become one of his infamous paper girls. These paper girls are basically the king's possessions and concubines, meant to fulfill the king's every desire when they are summoned, but Lei ends up falling for one of her fellow paper girls instead. This story contains triggers for scenes of violence, brutality, and sexual assault, and in the very beginning there is a pretty graphic animal death, which I wish I had known about up front. Because of the way the protagonist is thrust into this unpredictable, dangerous court setting, this story has very naturally high stakes. That kept me feeling invested very early on because Lei knows nothing of the court, knows nothing of this world, and she has to be very deliberate about what she does in order to survive. And that's heightened even more when Lei not only takes on a lover, but starts trysting with another paper girl at that. The story is also very vocal about this idea that love gives us the strength and the will to fight back. It anchors us to a purpose bigger than ourselves. I think my biggest hang-up for this book was the inconsistent pace. A majority of the story lacks enough urgency because there's no real plot development happening besides Lei gaining a general understanding of how the court works and thinking about how much she hates it, which should be obvious. It's not until the final act that Lei realizes that as paper girls, they're in a very unique position where they're extremely close to the king and they have opportunities to wreak havoc and deal some serious damage. And because things finally begin to take shape and escalate in that final part, I definitely feel like the story set up a potentially strong sequel that could go to some really fascinating places. So while I definitely enjoyed this, I do have to say there was a little bit of untapped potential here, and in some ways the story was a bit too on the nose when it comes to the outline of your typical YA court fantasy, which is why I gave this 3.5 stars. By the end of the week, this was my bingo board, and I was actually surprised to see I made bingo 3 times, which is funny because I did not actually plan to make bingo even once. So those are all the books I read for the Queer Lit Read-a-thon, and in the comments I would love to know what you thought of the books that you read for this event. But that's everything I had for this readathon wrap-up today. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope that you enjoyed it, and I'll catch you on the flip side of the page. Bye!